One of the mistakes that I made very early on as a pen tester is I've overlooked this one area. I really did not give it its due justice, its credit, because learning this skill set is actually extremely important. When I first started, I thought this was just for CTFs, for challenges and stuff like that. And as I've leveled up and have been a part of better and better security organizations within the companies that I've worked for, I've noticed that it went from something that I thought was just something you do for a challenge to, wow, this is actually extremely useful. And talking to other people that I've coached over the last couple of years, I've noticed I'm not alone. A lot of people make this mistake as well, where they undervalue this skill set. So what I have right here is the Try Hack Me room to Windows privilege escalation. And even if it's Linux privilege escalation, I think you can kind of lump that in with this as well as something that a lot of people undervalue. Privilege escalation is extremely practical in your day-to-day job as a pen tester or as a red teamer. Now, this is part of the red team path, so we're going to be really highlighting where this fits in for a red teamer, but very much so, this fits in for pen testers as well. A mistake that I've seen so many people make, myself included, is that they're afraid to push further in privilege escalation. They get that initial code execution and they stop there. They report it and they say, hey, this is the issue, but they don't take that extra step. It's so important as a pen tester, especially, you push things as far as you can as possible because you want to be able to demonstrate that level of impact to the client so they can actually leverage the value of having a real human pen testing your stuff instead of just running some scan tool that will just report issues in isolation. We really want to drive home the impact of how all of our issues fit together for a full narrative of what an attacker could actually do against these systems. And of course, as a red teamer for privilege escalation, well, it will assist us ultimately in our objectives, whatever they may be, whether it's getting domain admin, maybe exfiltrating a certain piece of data. If we have higher levels of privilege, of course, we could do much more. But this will be a pretty lengthy one, so strap in. We're going to get right into the action here. And before I do that, I will say, as you're learning this stuff and leveling up, you are going to want to, utilize the note sheet that I built up over the last 5 years in the field. So definitely down in the description below for absolute free, check out my pen tester note sheet as well. So yeah, let's dive into it, and we'll start off here with some basics of privilege escalation, right? Of course, with Windows, what we're focusing on here, you have users, and there's some built-in users that are important to be aware of. So system, local system, this is the highest level of privilege on Windows. It's actually not the administrator account. This has even higher privileges than administrator, as it mentions here. So ultimately, this would be our goal if we're trying to get privilege escalation, right? You also have some service accounts that have a little bit lower privileges, like local service, network service, and things like that. And they give you some more breakdown here. I don't want to read everything off the slides here. I'll leave that to you if you want to go through this room, which I would recommend as well. But just sort of moving forward here, we'll look at a few ways we can harvest credentials, some typical areas, right? Unattended Windows installations. This would be like if you installed Windows with a script, like if you ever installed, say, the Commando VM from Mandiant. This is an example of an unattended Windows installation for the most part, because it will use your credentials and automatically sign in for you when it has to reboot, and it'll keep installing packages. And for the most part, you can install that entire package, all those packages, without having to interact as the user. You just run the script, does it for you. This is what's known as an unattended Windows installation. Now, of course, in order for it to be able to log in as you, it's going to have your credentials. So for stuff like this, here's some common locations where you might be able to find some hard-coded credentials that you could then use. And of course, PowerShell history file is similar to Bash history, right? It's the history of the PowerShell commands that you've ran on the server. And you could have some saved creds that you use as well. And of course, your web server configuration file, same as Linux there. And even some other software that might use credentials like PuTTY for SSH and things like that. I think this is super straightforward. I don't really want to spend the time to basically browse to files and open them in Notepad and just look at credentials, because I think it's super straightforward, even for those of you that are super beginner out there. So we're just going to kind of move on for right now. We'll dive into some really practical hands-on stuff here in a little bit. So some other quick wins. Scheduled tasks. This one is really big. as well. You can see this in Linux also with cron jobs, but the Windows task scheduler is what you would call it on Windows, right? Same concept. It'll run a job at some kind of interval that you specify. So there's some useful utils, right? Like the scheduled tasks. You can run queries on them to see like what the different tasks are. Also, iCackles. You can see what level of access you have. Different accounts have, not even just you, right? So you can see like, okay, administrators have full access and all the built-in users have. So basically everyone has full access on this scheduled task, which, hey, it could be pretty useful, right? Depending on, level of access it's running as, what account. And so looks like they're actually walking us through here on a specific exploit for this, right? You could just replace it with your own scheduled task file of the same name that would generate a reverse shell for you. Then you just listen for that connection and you get a reverse shell. And then, that's something we'll demo here in a second. But you also have this thing here called always install elevated. So Windows installation files, .msi files, they usually run with the privilege of the user that starts it, but they can be configured to run with higher privileges automatically. So obviously if that is enabled, which you can see if it's enabled by running this registry query here, a couple of these queries will tell you. And if that's the case, then you can just generate your own malicious executable. And whenever you run that MSI file, because it's always install elevated, it's going to run as system. So therefore you'll catch a shell as system. So pretty straightforward. That's how that works. But let's go ahead and demo that out. So I think it's in, okay, yeah. I went ahead and I launched this target server here. So that said, let me just grab the credentials. And I think I might be good to go on that actually. Just got to put in the IP. And I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. And I'm just going to remote into this server and we can start playing around with these techniques that they had showed us. So just remote desktop in and then do this so we can see the full screen here. And there were some scheduled tasks, right? So we could query those up. We also, since we have GUI access, we could always just look through the scheduled tasks in the GUI if we wanted to as well. But since we're usually going to be working off command line access, I'll do this on command line. So this specifically was the query that they ran on the scheduled tasks, and that's how they found this one here. So if I run that same command, and let me make this a little bit larger here really quickly. We'll bump the font up to 28. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, just running this query here, we can see some info on this job. And particularly, we can see that this task is enabled and it's going to be run as task user 1. So if we can exploit this, we probably will get a shell as task user 1. And it's running a batch file in C tasks. And we could see as well if that is a directory that we have control over using the iCackles command. We can see if we have control over this file specifically with iCackles. So if we were to do that, and I did not copy properly, I'm just going to type it out for right now. iCackles and C, what was it? C tasks, scheduled task.bat. And we can see administrator and all built-in users have full access. So yeah, we have full control over this bat file. So since that is the case, what we could do is go into MSF Venom and generate a payload. So we'll just give it the same name because it's baked into the task scheduler that it needs to be. It's going to be looking for specifically a bat file called scheduled task.bat. So we have to specify that. We'll make that the format. Yeah, everything else looks good to me. So let's just go ahead and generate that one. And then we're going to want to transfer that over as well. What I'm going to do, and this is just for easy cleanup, I'm not going to delete this file. Rather, I am going to just rename it. So if I do a move C tasks, scheduled task.bat to C tasks, scheduled task.bat.back for like backup, we can then back it up in that way. And I'll just go ahead and maybe I should have moved into that directory earlier, but I'll just go ahead and go into tasks now. And we're going to do the file transfer. And we're going to bring in that new file. So the IP address of my Kali Linux machine, 72. And the name of the file is the same here. And oops, we didn't start up our Python web server. And looks like, so bat is not a format. Let's see what they did in here in terms of generating that. So it could just be that okay, so they just moved in netcat and they just saved it to a file called that. Okay, so yeah, in this case, there's some different ways we could go about doing this because MSF Venom doesn't have a .bat format supported. So another way we can do this is just this echo command here of netcat64. So we can transfer the netcat binary. I believe I have that already in opt. Let's see here, netcat64.exe. So let's just go ahead and run the Python web server here, and we'll do that file transfer over. So let's just put this, and there you go. And actually put this in C tasks. This should be okay. And the next thing we want to do is, I mean, we could literally just copy and paste this command in here. And so we'll listen on port quad 4 as well, so we can catch that reverse shell. And yeah, we'll just run this command. I have echo there twice. Let me fix that. And I didn't, my mistake there, I did not put it in tools. I put it in tasks. So let's fix that. And yeah, there we go. Let's just make sure that this line exists in scheduled task.bat. So if I just read that file, everything looks not okay because I actually do realize the mistake I made. I put attacker IP, I just kind of copy pasted. What we actually need is the IP address of our Kali Linux machine, of course. Now let's try that, read it, make sure everything looks good, and it does. So now that that is there for the scheduled task, we could just wait on it to run again, but a faster way is we could run it manually with this scheduled task command. So let's go ahead and do it that way. This wants to paste for us, but if not, then we'll have to do it manually. Hopefully that copy paste issue works itself out, because that's going to help for later on. But we'll run vuln task. And all right, attempted to run. Now we check here and we have a reverse shell as task user 1 as we expected. So from there, we can just jump into the desktop, read the flag off, and that would get us our first flag. So the next thing that we cover is abusing some of these different service misconfigurations, which is a huge part of Windows privilege escalation for sure. So some of the really helpful commands we can run is this service command here, sc. We can query for the different properties and parameters associated with the service. We could see if it's running, if it's set to automatically run, you know, if it's stopped, things like that, where the binary path is. This is really important. This is what it's actually running when the service starts. And so there's a bunch of potential vulnerabilities associated with this if they're misconfigured. So what does that look like, right? Okay, one thing it's explaining here, first of all, is that there's registry parameters associated with this stuff as well. This is how you would actually look into the stuff if you had GUI access. Of course, we're going to focus on command line, though, as well. So insecure permissions, right? So, well, there's a number of things that could be insecure. One of them is, you know, what are the level of access to these binaries that they're running, right? So in this case, looking at the Windows scheduler service, you have this executable here in this path, the wservice.exe. If you drill down further and you see what are the permissions on this executable, you can see in this case, everyone has read and execute. Administrators and system have full access, and then, you know, and so on and so forth, read and execute for these users here. If everyone has permissions, right, So in this case, it's talking about if everyone has modify, which is M, then anyone can override it with any payload, right? So if you had those permissions, you could just generate a executable, and you could, in this case, name it whatever, because if you have the ability to overwrite the properties here, you could just tell it to point to whatever executable you want, and you just run that whenever it starts up. In this case, it looks like it's going to be running as SVC user 1, so we wouldn't get access as system, we would get it as this user, which could help us then later getting into the system account. So with privilege escalation, you're not always going to be able to jump straight to admin or straight to local system. Sometimes you have to jump to another user, and then that user can privilege escalate from there to get system and so forth. But yeah, you would generate your own malicious executable, transfer it over, and then just point, well, in this case, yeah, they're just overriding the file as wservice.exe. So if you could overwrite this path, then you could name it whatever you want. In the case that you don't have permissions to overwrite the path, but you have full permissions on wservice.exe, you just generate your own malicious executable, rename it to wservice.exe, then it now points to your malicious one, right? Pretty similar to what we did a second ago. That's one type of misconfiguration. The other one is not quoting the service path. So what does that mean? If you look here in the binary path name, this would be an example of a quoted service path. So with this, it's specifically looking in C, program files, real VNC, VNC server, for a file called vncserver.exe. Nothing vulnerable with this piece right here. But however, if you instead had something like this as the binary path, notice there are no quotes surrounding this. It's very interesting how Windows goes about trying to figure out what you're trying to actually run. It doesn't know. So what it's going to do is it's going to look up everything up into the space and treat that as its own executable. So what I mean by that is it's going to look in a number of places. So the very first thing it's going to look for is this right here up into the space. So it's going to look in C, my programs, for a executable called disk.exe. That's the first thing it's going to do. And then the next thing it's going to do is look for disk sorter exe. And then it's going to look in this entire folder here for one called bin.exe, I believe. Well, actually, no, there is no space there. So from there, it's actually just going to look for the full thing. But the point being is anytime you see the space here, it's going to stop and look for an executable named that. If we have write access to the My Programs folder, we can just create a malicious binary called disk.exe, and it will automatically try to run that because it's going to look for this before it looks for this full thing here. That is the key. So in that way, we can hijack this path here because it's unquoted. So let's just go ahead and exploit that. I believe that's the next step. Let me not get ahead of myself. Let's scroll down a little bit here. I think it wants us to do a couple of things, right? If we look here, and of course there are more. There's 3 different ones here. First thing it wants us to do is exploit that first one to get code execution as SVC user 1. Then we'll do what I just talked about with the unquoted service path for SVC user 2. Then it wants us to get admin using this one here, this vulnerable service that we'll look into in just a second. But before I bombard you with too much theory, let's jump into exploiting the first case here with this Windows scheduler. Let's see if the copy paste wants to work for me or not. Yeah, it did. There we go. A little bit more than I wanted. So yeah, if we query for this service, we can see basically the same stuff that we saw earlier. It's running at the moment, auto start, display name, system schedule service. It's trying to run this here. So if we see what permissions we have on that with iCackles, we can see that, first of all, let's refresh my memory. Who am I? We are the THM unprivileged user. So we're not an administrator. We're not NT authority system. We're just a user. We have read and execute. And, but we are part of everyone. So that's the key here. Everyone has modify. So we can modify this file. So that right there is the misconfiguration. And so what we can do is exactly what we were looking at earlier. If I just change directories into here, I am going to rename wservice.exe into wservice.exe.back just to back it up. So then if we're doing this on a real engagement, after we exploit this, we can restore everything back just by renaming it back to the .exe extension. We'll go ahead and exit out of this one, and let's jump back over to MSF Venom. And this time we will call it wservice.exe. Make sure this is an executable format, and everything else looks good. So we'll just go ahead and generate that, and we'll also go ahead and start up our Python web server, and it looks like that's just about done. So let's transfer the file over using certutil. So we'll do that, and this is wservice.exe, and I'm missing a slash here. And yeah, everything looks good here. We see wservice.exe. This is set to, this is not a scheduled task. This is actually a service. So what we're going to need to do is stop and then start the service. We can use the sc utility for that. So we could say sc stop Windows, I think it was called Windows Scheduler, was it? Yep. And let's not forget to get that listener going, netcat listener, and I think I had 443 if I'm not mistaken, so let's set it for that. And so now when I start the service, we should catch that reverse shell, and we do. Who am I? We are svc user 1. So then we can just go into the desktop, read the flag, and we are good to go on that one. Awesome. So moving forward here to the next one, we have the unquoted service path that we were looking at earlier. And specifically, if we query this, here's where we should see that unquoted service path. I'm just going to go ahead and restart this listener. We'll use it here in just a minute. So let's take a look at this service here. Notice that the path is unquoted. And what we can do, so we could use iCackles to verify our permissions. Another thing we can do is simply test our permissions. So if I go in to see my programs, and let's just say I try to create a file, what happens, right? Well, we're able to write to this directory. So that's literally the only permissions we need in order to exploit this, since it's an unquoted path. So let me go ahead and delete that just to clean up after myself. And if we want to exploit this, now we will go back to MSF Venom, and actually we can reuse the same payload. I'm going to copy wservice.exe as disk.exe. No reason to regenerate that and use up all the time doing that. Pretty much have it good to go. So from here, we can do another certutil. I'm just going to up arrow that to make it a bit easier. And take disk.exe. And now as you see, we have disk.exe located in C my programs. So now in order to exploit this, we'll go to the listener, make sure it's running. All we need to do is start and stop the services. So we can do sc stop, and what was the service? This long thing here, so probably gonna want to just copy paste that. So we're gonna stop this service. And then when we start it, we should be able to hijack that path. So, yep, and we get the reverse shell. Perfect. So we are now SVC user 2. And then the last technique that they demonstrate to us here is going to allow us to get code execution as administrator. But before we jump into that, one thing I wanted to showcase was actually we can do privilege escalate from here. So just like I was talking about earlier, chaining your privilege escalation together, maybe you jump to another user and from that user you get to system. So if I look at whoami/priv, what I can actually see is we have SE impersonate privilege. And the next thing I want to check is system info to see exactly what version of Windows we're up against. It's server 2019 data center. So one thing that we can try, since we have these privileges, is some token impersonation using print spoofer. In order to do that, I'm in the opt directory right now. I have this one here. You can grab it off of GitHub. It's called print spoofer. If I want to grab that, let's see, where are we? Okay, we got our web server going still, so I can simply just transfer that one over. I'm just going to go into C users, SVC user to documents. And yeah, we'll drop it in there. So cert util URL cache. I don't know why I don't really look down at my hands when I type, but for whatever reason, like when the mic's right here, it just throws me off. But we'll do 10.6.0.72 and let's see here, print spoofer.exe. Cool. So we have the file over here. So now what we can do is run that. So I might have to look this one up. This is another one that I usually don't remember off the top of my head. Let me just consult the notes here real quick. See how I ran this one last time, which is something that I would definitely recommend for you guys as well. All right, so it wants us to pass in a binary, which we already uploaded a binary in the previous step, so we could actually utilize that. So we could say run C my programs, and then disk. We could just have it run that same executable again, which should help us catch that reverse shell on port 443, although we're going to need to make sure we have that listener going. So something like that should work. Let's give that a try. And actually, maybe we don't. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, we do need the listener there. And we caught it. And now we are into the authority system. So that's one way that you can exploit the token impersonation, which is something it's going to talk about. But this is an alternative way to get NT authority system. The way that they did it up here, or down here, I guess, is another way by exploiting an insecure service. So if we upload this access check, which is provided by the sysinternal suite, we can actually start looking at some of these services here. So we don't need this anymore. Let's just go ahead and do that. So actually for this one, we actually don't need this anymore either. And as you see in the opt directory, I already have access check 64.exe. So let's just go ahead and upload that to the server. So C users, what is it? THM unpriv. We'll go into like documents or something like that. And we'll just upload that. Access check 64.exe. So cool. We have that. And so we can run that to query this. Now, one thing they don't mention here is we need to add accept EULA, because if we don't, there's going to be an end user license agreement popping up in our face. Well, actually, we don't have to do that because we're on the server, right? But if we didn't have GUI access, this would be a showstopper for us. So if let's say we didn't have an RDP session, what we need to add is, that's interesting that popped up because I thought Defender should be turned off, but we would need to add tac accept EULA, and then we won't see that, and it'll just dump it to screen. So something you want to make a note of for sure, because most likely you're not going to have GUI access. Here's where we can see a bunch of the permissions on this service here. And essentially what we're looking for here is the permissions of the built-in users group. And you see it has service all access. And if we come back here, we should see that as well. Built-in users, service all access. So since we have all access, we can modify that binary path. The first thing they're going to do is just generate that executable. And I mean, we don't really have to do that because we already generated an executable. We have it on this box, so we can just leverage that. So then using iCackles, we'll grant everyone permission to the executable. So let's just kind of skip the first step, go to the second step. So we'll do C. We'll just use the same one. Again, my programs. Oh, no. Looks like it's going to make me do that one over. That's fine. grant everyone full permissions. Cannot find, okay, maybe did it disappear on me? I know this happened last time when I was doing some testing. Let's just take a look. Yeah, so that one cleaned itself up. What we could do is we could just generate it then. I am going to generate this executable. Or I just transfer it over. Yeah, let's just transfer it. I really don't want to wait on this. I'm really being lazy here today, but let's just up arrow this. Let's be even more lazy. So we're going to grab disk.exe. Cool. And we have disk.exe right here in documents. And so now let's grant everyone access to that full control. So we do C users thm documents and disk.exe/grant everyone full. I forget the exact syntax. Okay. I cannot find file specified. What happened here? Did I mistype something? Oh yeah, I typed downloads instead of, I think it auto-completed downloads instead of documents. So cool, there we go. Now that time it worked finally. And the third time is a charm thing. So now we can use scconfig to modify the binary path and just point it to our executable. So let's do that. We'll copy this beginning part here first. And then I'll copy the path. And then we'll copy this last part here. Object equals local system. That way it will run it as system and we'll get that system shell, which is of course what we're after. So in order to then catch that, we'll set up the netcat listener and we'll go ahead and stop and start the services so that this actually runs our binary. So same as always, sc stop, and then thm service, I think it was called. Yeah. So first we stop the services, which actually it wasn't even running to begin with. So all we need to do really is start the service. And then if we check here, we now have a shell as the NT authority system in this case, right? Because we said local system. So yeah, we have the highest level of local access that we can have. The next thing it covers is how we can, abuse some dangerous permissions that we might have. And particularly it shows us 3 different ways to do it. One is if you are like a backup operator, then you basically have SE backup or SE restore privileges. You can use those in order to copy the Hive and the system files. And then you can use either Impacket secret stump or something like PyPyCats to extract the hashes from the SAM and system. And this is something that is definitely like a core fundamental privilege escalation technique to know how to do. So I'm not going to cover that one in this video. So definitely if you've never done that before, please go and do this room and practice this technique because I promise it's going to be very useful for you in your learning journey. The next thing it covers is something that is a pretty novel thing, at least to me. I had never seen it before. I thought it was super cool, is actually utilizing the SE take ownership privileges in order to hijack utilman.exe and get a system shell that way. That one was super cool. I've never actually heard of this technique. Let me know in this comment section below if this is something you've done on a real assessment or something. I'd love to know. But yeah, this one was really cool. We'll demo this in a second. The third one that it showed, third way I basically showed earlier, is abusing the SE impersonate or SE assign primary token privileges in order to get a system shell. Now, they didn't use print spoofer in this case. They actually used another similar exploit executable here called roguewinrm.exe. So you can reference this room as well to see exactly how they did that. But basically our task is to just use any of those 3 techniques in order to get the administrator flag. Now this is on a different system. While I was talking, I should have started it up So I'm gonna have to wait for a second here, unfortunately, but let's just go ahead and start this up, and we will then log in with, where is it? These credentials here, but we'll have to give it just a minute to start up. But just kind of walking through this attack, the first thing we're gonna do is launch our command prompt as admin using the privileges that we have. And then when we look at whoami/priv, we'll see mention of SE take ownership privileges. Now, one thing that I find interesting is it can be misleading to see state disabled. Don't assume like, oh, state is disabled, so I don't have SE take ownership privileges. Actually, you do have those privileges, as we'll see here in a second, because we'll actually be able to use the take ownership in order to take ownership of utilman.exe. And once we take ownership of it, because we now own that file, we can assign any permissions we want. So we can simply grant ourselves full ownership over that file. And then with full ownership on it, we can just do something like copying the command prompt to that, basically renaming the command prompt to utilman.exe via the copy command. So then what that means is when we lock our computer, what utilman.exe is to begin with is if your screen is locked and you hit the ease of access button, that will pull up utilman.exe. You can also just run it while the system is running. But when it's locked, it'll actually run it as system. So if I copy cmd.exe to utilman.exe, when I click the ease of access button, it's going to launch a command prompt, and because that will typically run as system, the command prompt will also have system privileges. So that is the full privilege escalation technique. Let's go ahead and see it in action here. So I can, once again, I can go ahead and close out of that. And now I'm gonna need to log into this new machine here. So let me do a couple things here. I'm gonna put in this new IP address, and then there's some new credentials we're gonna have to slot in here as well. Scroll up, but not too far. This is the user. And then we got the password right here. And then, yeah, once it logs in, what we're gonna do is spawn the command prompt, if you recall. So click in here, CMD, right click, run as administrator, and the password is the world is mine 2022. And all right, so if I run whoami/priv, we can see SE take ownership privilege here. Never mind the state as disabled. We do have this permission, as we'll see. And so from here, we can run the take ownership. So let's go to this one, take ownership, copy paste this. Looks like the font is still bigger. Okay, there we go, cool. So awesome, success, we've taken ownership. Now we're gonna assign ourselves full privilege. And we now have full privilege. And so now we're just going to copy cmd.exe into utilman.exe. And of course, if you're doing this for the first time, definitely take notes on this, add it to your notes, and then you'll have it in your tool belt for the future. So now everything should be good to go. All we have to do, click here, lock the screen. And now when we click ease of access, it spawns a command prompt as well. And if we run whoami, we see we are now system. So yeah, really cool privilege escalation technique, I would certainly say. Last but not least, don't forget that if there's any installed applications that are running on the server, those are very much juicy targets in order to potentially escalate privileges. That's where I would definitely leverage looking for known public exploits on like exploitDB, GitHub, Google search in general. It's very useful there. And one thing you can do to query for some unpatched software is using the WMIC command. I'm not going to run this. It takes quite a while to run on the VM here. They didn't give very many resources to, so I don't want to just be sitting here for like 5 minutes waiting on this thing to run. But if I ran this, one thing that would come up is Druva InSync version 663. And also they say, keep in mind, this is not going to show you all the installed programs. Depending on how some programs are installed, they might not get listed here. So just keep that one in mind as well. But we would see Druva in sync 663. If you do some searching online, you'll see this guy reported the vulnerability here for privilege escalation. There's a whole blog post here that you can read as well. And you can actually see how he was able to use IDA to kind of reverse engineer. This might be how he found the issue initially in this closed source application here. So pretty cool. Definitely, if you're interested in like reverse engineering and looking for, doing some exploit development, I would definitely give this one a read as well. You see some string compare stuff, I guess, that he found probably relating to the issue as well. I'm guessing then this program was probably written in like C, C++, something like that. But here's like a high-level overview how you interact with this service. It's running RPC, which is the remote procedure call. So basically exposing one of its functions over the network so that other applications can interact with it and use the function. So the way you would interact with this service is you would first send a hello packet, and then the remote procedure call ID that you want to use, so ID 5 in this case, that's the one that's vulnerable, and your command length, and then the command string, where they're trying to restrict you from only being able to run any arbitrary command inside the program data Druva insync 4 folder. But what they don't account for is the fact that they don't prevent you from just escaping out of that directory and say, hey, let's go back all the way to the root of the C drive and then take me into Windows System32 cmd.exe. And that is something they do not prevent against. So we can just supply that as our command string and then just run any arbitrary command. We're going to do that here. Here's the exploit. They also already have the exploit on the server very conveniently for you. And with this POC, it's simply going to add a user called pwned. It's not going to set a password for us or anything. It's not even going to add that user to admin. So in order to make this POC a little bit more useful, we can simply modify that line, add our user to the administrators group, and also assign a password that we can use to then log in as that user to obtain those admin privs. So let's just go ahead and do that. I'm going to copy this line here. And actually, before I do any of that, we're going to need to, of course, remote in to the system. Let's see. Do they give us... I think the creds are the same. Yeah, the creds are the same as before. It's just going to be a different IP address for us. So let's just go up here. Slap in the new IP, and we should be good to go on that one. While that is connecting, what I'm going to do is now copy this line, and they say that the exploit is already provided for us in the C tools folder. So right here as a text file. And so let me open up the Explorer, the Windows File Explorer, and then we're going to go, and you can even see Druva insync icon right here. You go to C tools, and you got this file here. I'm just going to edit that. We're going to modify the command right here inside these quotes to this, and I'm actually going to save this as a .ps1 file. And now that I've done that, I'm just going to, let's see here, shift right click, open PowerShell window. And now I'm just going to run that PowerShell script. And so after I run that, if I run net users, you can see that it created this pwned user. From there, I'm going to spawn a command prompt, right click, run as administrator. And I'm going to go to more choices, and I'm going to choose pwned, and then type simple pass 123. And that should spawn an administrator command prompt. So let's see here. We won't be able to see with who am I because it will just be that user. But if we run like net user pwned, you can see it's part of the administrators group. And just to prove it even further, I can go into C users administrator desktop, and I can read the flag.txt file as well, proving that we are in fact administrator. And from here, they just show us some additional stuff for finding these issues, right? You have like your Windows privilege escalation scripts that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, like WinPs. I really like this priv-s check. I'm glad they gave a shout out to this one. This is my go-to over WinPs. It's less verbose. It's easier for me to identify the actual privilege escalation vectors. For me personally, this is always the first one that I run when I go to run a Windows privilege escalation script. But then you also have Windows Exploit Suggester Next Gen. Not one that I've used too much, but it is. I have used the older one, and it is pretty good as well. And of course, Metasploit has like its own built-in local exploit suggester as well. And yeah, that's pretty much all for this room. Let me know what you guys think of this series so far. I know this one was quite a long one, but this is a very important area. If you were thinking this is just for CTF, you were skipping out on it, I definitely encourage you to do this room. You know, start taking the privilege escalation stuff more serious. I found privilege escalation in the real world on a number of assessments that I've done. And definitely this is an area where you want to be solid. And it's really not too difficult once you learn the fundamentals. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. If you want to get into some more technical content, I have that on the screen for you right now. I'll see you guys right over in those videos. Thanks for watching.